Alright, hello and finally welcome to the secondary weapon review. This is going to work pretty similarly to the melee weapon review, except because the secondary weapons are all pretty close to one another and there's not like big distinctions like whips versus daggers and things like that. It's pretty much gun versus gun. There's going to be great, good MR fodder, and then my top 5 secondary weapons to keep things a little more simple and a little more readable. So, with that, let's get started. Alright, first up we have the Acrid. Unfortunately, this weapon is MR locked to 7, so by the time you can actually get this weapon, it is severely outclassed by other available weapons, making this, unfortunately, MR fodder. If the MR on this gets lowered, it might fall into the good category, and it's worth noting that in the past, this weapon has been outstanding in like damage 1.0 and such. But, unfortunately, that doesn't hold up now. The Furious. Too long to build, not enough firepower, abysmal status and crit chance, no reason to use these, MR fodder. For pretty similar reasons, the Bolto, except for add travel time to one of the downsides of this weapon, and absurd build cost, MR fodder. The regular Broncos they don't do enough. They take too long to build, they've got nothing going for them. By the time you would build these weapons, you can have significantly better equipment. The Bronco Prime, on the other hand, end up being in the good tier. Just barely, and this is pretty much 100% due to them having a really good status line. Outside of that, though, they just barely cut into the good category. They're just okay. But if you really want to use a secondary shotgun that has status, then this is not an awful way to go. The Jagera, also falling into the good category. These weapons are nice. These are particularly, their niche use is for Necros, because these weapons are very efficient at cutting up bodies. Other than that, though, they have a decent output, being mostly slash-focused and having status. Makes them significantly better than you might expect. The downside of these weapons is that their build cost is pretty damn high, but they're fun. I expect if we get a prime of this weapon for them to be very, very good. The Lottos. Everything in the Lotto series is a marshmallow gun. I mean, they're just hard MR fodder over here. The Lex, on the other hand, is a great mid-game weapon. When you can build these, which is honestly very, very early, these weapons are fantastic to have around, and they pretty much patch up the downside to the single Lex whenever you're early on, which is not having enough fire rate and not having enough shots in mag. These completely fix that at an incredibly low cost, so there you have it. Following along with that same logic, the Lex Prime. So, we're going to talk about the Lex Prime, but this is my number 2. Lex Prime is so good. You're just holding 2 of previously one of like the top 2 weapons in the game for secondaries period. It's death. You're holding just 2 it's ridiculous. Just blow things apart. They have good status. You can build for status if you want to, although that's better on another weapon we're going to be talking about in our top 5. Actually, 2 other weapons we're going to be talking about in the top 5. You can do so much damage with these. Up to around level 80s, they just kill everything in like one shot. It's just over. If you shoot something in the head with it, it's dead. It's gone. It can't handle it. And these have enough ammo now with a high enough fire rate, you can just burst things down. It's hard to find better. Moving on, we've got the Magnus. So, these weapons are pretty great. They're at like kind of the bottom of my great category, just kind of barely making it because they take so much work to get to the point where they're good enough. But very high crit chance, along with very high status, means that these weapons are definitely worth putting the work into if you like them. The Axomati, also, not surprisingly probably to many people, falling into the great category. These weapons can output a lot of damage. This is your secondary equivalent to the Soma, of course. And they only have one real downside, is that their status is a bit low, but with as many bullets as these things can put out, they're pretty goddamn powerful. The one big downside to these is that their ammo economy is not great, but that can be pretty easily patched up by putting a good ammo mutation on this, or even just bringing carrier, and that problem pretty much goes away, so these end up being really, really good. Alright, the Stilettos. So, these are, not surprisingly, in the great category, but that comes with a caveat. If you're not building these early, they're only good. So, if you're an earlier player, get a clan, get these researched, or you join a clan that has these researched, build it. It's a pretty simple build that will get you through a lot of content in the game, which means that these are in great or good depending on where you are, essentially. If you're building them early, they're fantastic. If you're building them late, they're just alright. But These are really impressive weapons for what they are, and if you're looking for a machine gun, this is a good way to go. Speaking of a good way to go, their Prime version is my #1. These weapons are just fantastic. Machine guns, incredibly high status, can tear through armor, can apply whatever the fuck you need. They do a ton of damage. Like, there's not really a downside to these things. The crit build, like you would use with Lex, only with a status tilt to it, is incredibly powerful, and it's just not really possible to beat. Along with that, how nullifiers and a lot of other enemies are right now, and just the nature of Warframe being very horde-based, using these to mow down entire platoons of enemies is just faster in a lot of cases than any other secondary, and that's why it's #1. They just shred motherfuckers, and there's not much more to be said besides that. The Act Vasto. So, I'm going to put these in the good category with a caveat. If you don't build these super early, they're pretty much MR fodder, but if you're looking for some revolvers, these are pretty cheap, and you can build them early on, and they'll do you well. They're very effective in just the very early game, but I have a feeling that most players aren't going to build them until they're a little past where this weapon is good, so it's a bit unfortunate for them. The Akzani, very similar to the Ak Vasto, actually, in that these weapons are fine, but most players will probably come to them too late, and around the same time you can build the Akzani, you should probably be looking at the Ak Stilettos instead, but that puts these at like very low good tier as opposed to being MR fodder, with the caveat that even if you're just to Jupiter, probably not worth investing in these weapons anymore. The Angstrom, a weapon that I enjoy, but is unfortunately MR fodder. This weapon does alright damage, but the weird way that this weapon fires and its ability to kill you whenever you're standing too close to objects because of its incredibly wide spread just makes this weapon not really worth using. That, coupled with low crit chance, low status chance, just ends up making this weapon not worth using, especially with how much you need to reload it. The Atamos, this weapon falls into the great category. This weapon will clear trash mobs in seconds. This is one of the few weapons that can use Ruinous Extension to great effect because it extends the range at which enemies will connect to other enemies for more damage. So that means that this weapon is basically a handheld Ember, and you can burn down trash mobs very, very quickly with pretty much no resistance. Couple that with it just having pure elemental damage, meaning you can just adjust it to the defenses that you need and just burn motherfuckers down. The Azima. So if this weapon was a weapon you could just build, I'd probably say it was pretty good. Unfortunately, this is a 100-day login reward, which means a couple of things. If you've only been logging in for 100 days and not really playing Warframe, it might be good. But if you've actually been playing Warframe for 100 days, this weapon's probably going to get you absolutely nowhere, which makes it MR fodder, unfortunately. The Ballistica, unlike its Rakta variant, this is MR fodder. It's really not worth building into, and it's got really strange recoil, and its charging mechanic is fine, but is not really that particularly useful. So, unfortunate MR fodder. A single Bolto, if you thought the Ak Bolto was MR fodder, a single Bolto is like double MR fodder. The Brack, this weapon actually falls into the great category, and I would say it's probably the best secondary shotgun, with one niche exception that's Warframe specific. But this weapon can put out a very respectable amount of damage, and it's pretty easy to farm once you get into the raiding section of things, so if you're looking for a shotgun as your secondary, this is a good way to go about it, and it's pretty easy to get. A single Bronco. Hard MR fodder. Just, MR fodder. One of these is not enough. Spoiler alert, MR fodder. The Kastana is slow, clunky, not enough damage, hard MR fodder. None of the trigger weapons are even like a little viable. The Zestra, travel time, inaccurate, low damage, low crit chance, low status, not much more to be said, MR fodder. The Despairs, these fall into the good category. If you get these early on, you can actually do a lot of work with these because they got pretty decent base damage, but later than that, they fall off pretty hard, which makes them just alright. Regular Detron, unlike the Brack, this is not very easy to get, which means not very useful, unfortunately. It's just not enough. Even the pure elemental nature of this, it's just not enough. The spread is too large, the crit chance is too low, the status chance is too low. It's just unfortunate. A higher fire rate, higher magazine size version of the weapon we just talked about. So it's just, there's a very niche use for this on mag, but it's just not, it's honestly, even then, it's not really worth carrying around this secondary. It's just not worth it. It's MR fodder. The Dex Furus. So this is an anniversary weapon, and it's okay. It's not like amazing or anything, but it is a bit of fun. I'm tempted to put this into the good category just because I like them, but I know in my heart this thing's just not that useful, and it's MR fodder. The Dual Sestra. Having 2 of them doesn't help. MR fodder. The Dual Toxicist. Surprisingly, I'm going to throw these into the great category. These actually perform really, really well, and honestly, they would not be terribly far away from making the top 5 if they could refresh their special buff that gives them unlimited ammo and a higher fire rate. These weapons can kick out a pretty good amount of damage, they've got the good status, and they're pretty solid overall, honestly. I mean, the main complaint I have with them is that you can't refresh their buff while their buff is still ongoing. If you could, these weapons would be very high tier great weapons. As it stands though, they're still great. The Embolist, unfortunately a relic of a time when continuous weapons were actually of any use. Not of any use now. MR fodder. The Single Furus. You actually may be surprised to know, this can use the mod Winds of Purity, which makes this an actually very reliable way to heal. So, that puts this in the good category. It's very niche, but it's equipable on any Warframe, and it's a way to heal, which means it's actually pretty solid, all things said, which is kind of sad, because the version where you have, like, the Dex or the AC is actually worse than just holding one of them in this case, because Winds of Purity works on this, which actually does make it that much better. The Gamma Core. Unfortunately, this is not its Syndicate variant, which means this weapon's just basically completely useless. It just doesn't do enough. The Hikau, I don't remember how you're supposed to say this, I'm being completely honest with you, but basically, this and its prime variant boil down to being vessels for concealed explosives, which makes them actually pretty goddamn useful in the early game. You can clear lots of trash mobs just using concealed explosives on these things. And beyond that, if you give these to the sortie defense targets, they can put in some goddamn work with these because they have perfect accuracy and never run out of ammo. So, this is a pretty good use for them. The same is pretty much said of the Hikau Prime, but obviously these have a higher magazine capacity, but a slower fire rate. The Comac. I love how this weapon sounds, but it's just not good enough. Unfortunate MR fodder. The Kraken. Alright, so this one boils down to the Lex is available. This weapon works almost identically to it. However, this weapon has a much higher cost, so this weapon ends up being just MR fodder. The Cull Star. So this weapon, I flip-flopped on it a little bit, putting it between good and great, because this weapon can kick out quite a bit of damage, and if you practice with it, there's some really cool things you can do with this weapon. However, I think that the ammo limitations of this weapon, along with you being able to kill yourself and that being fairly common in a lot of the tighter areas, makes this weapon just barely fall into the good category. But if you're looking for an explosive weapon to use, absolutely pick this up. The Kunai. The only reason to go to these from the Mark I Kunai is if you need the MR, so MR fodder. The Single Lotto. Well, I guess on the positive side, you can tend to campfire and shoot the marshmallows into it. Alright, the Single Lex. Everyone knows how much I like the Lex series. This falls into the great category, but that comes with a caveat. You can get this weapon incredibly early, and that is when it is great. If you get this weapon any later than, say, Mercury, you're gonna have a bad time with it, because at that point, that's when this starts falling off. But in the incredibly early game, this is a problem solver. It will take care of business, and is very, very good. Upgrading this into the Lex around Mercury is a very, very good idea. The Lex Prime. So this falls into number 3, which is not that surprising because number 2 is just holding 2 of these goddamn things. This has lower fire rate, lower magazine capacity. I mean, it has a higher accuracy technically, but the accuracy really doesn't matter too much in the grand scheme of things. Honestly, this weapon's fucking fantastic. It hits like a goddamn truck. It's very similar to the Lex Prime. Obviously, the Lex Prime just has the advantage of having more ammo, faster fire rate. It has a longer reload time whenever you have 2 of them, but you end up reloading less when you have 2 of them, period, so you just crush shit. You shoot this at things that need to go away. A Single Magnus. Unfortunately, 1 Magnus is not enough, and that puts it into the MR fodder category. However, when you're getting the MR out of this thing, you build another one, you get the AC Magnus, you put the work in, it becomes a pretty good weapon. The Marelok. So go directly to the great category. This weapon is fantastic. The whole Marelok series is great, and I would suggest you get one as soon as you possibly can. Either of them are amazing. We'll talk about the other one pretty soon here, but a single Marelok is totally fine. Good enough crit chance, really good status, really high base damage. and also is fancy as fuck. This weapon is great. The Mark I Furus. There's not really much reason to do this besides the mastery fodder. Like, you can just get a regular Furus and use Winds of Purity on that, so MR fodder. Mark I Kunai. I would actually say these are the best thing you can start with, but, I mean, they're MR fodder for the purposes of this, but if you're choosing a starter weapon, you grab these. You have something silent that you can use in early on spy vaults. They don't do abysmal damage really early on. It's an alright thing to have around. The Nucor. While this weapon is a ton of fun, and does have a very niche use with Syndicate due to its 4x critical multiplier and this very silly build you can do with it, this weapon ends up being MR fodder outside of its very silly gimmick builds. But if you're into silly gimmick builds, put the prime critical damage mods on this, bring a Syndicate, and do very hilarious damage while you have the red crits with this thing. This is a silly gun. This is a silly gun for silly people, but for everyone else, it's going to be MR fodder. The Pox. So, this may surprise you, but this weapon's actually great. This weapon can do so many status procs in an AoE. If you throw 2 of these with corrosive on an enemy, their armor's fucking gone. Like, it almost doesn't matter what level they are. And a lot of it, I mean, well, a lot of enemies will just die if you throw 1 of them at them. This weapon's actually way more solid than it probably should be, and it's worth using if you need the status, because you can just put AoE clouds of whatever the fuck you need, and it'll just do it for you. The Piranha. So I would throw this into the good category, and you may be able to make an argument for this being great if you put the heavy work into it because this is a critical weapon, but I will say, as a side note, this is the secondary I've had the most success with in Conclave, so if you're looking for a Conclave weapon, this is a good thing to bring. The Racta Ballistica. This, which may be surprising, falls into the great category. This weapon does a lot of damage. It has the Syndicate proc. It's just solid. Its charges will kill most things of any level you're likely to see, and it's just good. It'll give you energy. It does enough damage. The one big downside to this is that its burst fire has a really weird horizontal recoil that I personally find, like, just feels bad to use. But if you don't mind the recoil on this thing, absolutely pick it up. The Sancti Castanas, on the other hand, the trigger weapons, they're just not good enough. Even the Syndicate proc can't save this thing. The damage output is too low. The way this thing has fucky multi-shot is just not good. It's just not really worth using. It's MR fodder, but I mean, if you really need a trigger weapon, then maybe it just barely edges into good for you. Even worse than that, however, is the Secura Dual Sestra. So these things have the worst Syndicate proc, and they're fucking Sestras that they just don't. Like, how these are MR locked where they are and have this low of a critical chance, have this low of a status, and have such low accuracy and damage is completely fucking beyond me, honestly. I just don't get it. The Seer. So this weapon is, I mean, if they were to just automatically give this to you upon killing Vor, I might say it's good. But because you have to farm this from Vor, it's just not worth it at all, and it ends up being MR fodder, even though it's relatively similar to the Lex, except for it has travel time and has enhanced zoom, which is usually more disorienting than useful, and it just ends up not being great. The Sicarus. So, this may surprise you, but the regular Sicarus, if you enjoy burst weapons, is good. I would suggest picking it up as a new player who enjoys burst weapons. It obviously is not very good later on, but in the very early parts of the game, if you're looking for a burst secondary, yeah, it's decent enough. You could totally pick this up and use it. The Sicarus Prime. So I'm so glad that this weapon got buffed. This weapon is perfectly usable now. In fact, I would throw it into the great category. If you're looking for a burst secondary, fucking pick this thing up. It's fancy as fuck, its reload is immaculate, and now it's actually also worth using. It has good crit stats, status is on point because it's a burst weapon. It's fine. It's totally usable. If you put the work into it and you like burst weapons, this is probably going to be your go-to weapon. I'm so glad this got buffed. The Sonic Ore. So this weapon is fantastic. This weapon, it was hard to not put it in my top 5 because this is just on-demand, hard crowd control, send motherfuckers to space with it. Enemies cannot really deal with getting shot with this weapon. It doesn't seem like it does that much. Like, if you just look at the stats, it doesn't seem like this weapon would be that effective. Also, even though that says 0%, this weapon does have a status chance. It has hidden projectile stats, and it is way better than it lets on. It is really good, and it's just a secondary that is crowd control. Just, I need to clear this hallway, and they're gone. It's very, very powerful. Absolutely worth building. On the other hand, this Corpus technology is completely not worth it. 20% status a second may seem like a lot, but it's actually almost nothing, and the damage is also almost nothing, and the abysmal critical chance. There's no reason to use this weapon, it's MR fodder. It does look fancy though, so I guess it's got that going for it. The regular Spira. So I'm going to throw these into the good category, actually. For thrown weapons, they do good damage, they got good crit stats. Their status is nothing impressive, but it's like not like 1% either. It does enough damage to get you through some things if you're looking for a thrown weapon. It's a decent one to pick up. The Spira Prime. So, these have a very specific problem, and the regular Spira have it too. But at the point where you're building the regular Spira, it's much less important that this is a problem. For the Spira Prime, they have good accuracy on paper, but the way that they fire is in a weird triangle pattern, which unless you're going to like just devote hours and hours of your time getting adjusted to how the Spira Prime fires so you can actually land those headshots that this really high damage critical weapon wants. With fall off, with drop, with travel time, it's like it barely edges into the great category just because you can do really high damage with this weapon if you put so much practice into it. But for the huge majority of players, it's just not going to be good enough. However, I will say, if they go back and add the fan to the throwing weapons, if these get that, these will have very, very high burst damage that I would be excited to see how that works out. So they could become really, really good if they go back and add the fan throw to all of the throwing weapons. But as it stands right now, they just barely edge into the great category. Hopefully we see some changes with how these fire to make them more like the Despair. Alright, number 5, the Staticore. So, these are really, really powerful. High damage, coupled with high status, coupled with AoE, coupled with a charge mechanic that gives a larger AoE and more damage. It's hard to say bad things about these weapons. Also, purely elemental, which means your high status is even more effective because you're generally getting exactly the statuses you want and you're able to throw a lot out of them because you can just toss a ton. These are really good. They're really good. They're AoE clear, that does a lot of damage, that has good status. It's really hard to say bad things about these weapons. They're very, very powerful, and that's why they come in at number 5, of course. Alright, the Stug. So if you're early on and you're looking for an explosive weapon, I'm going to throw these into the good category. Because it's alright, it does decent damage, its firing mechanic is a little weird, but you can actually get some work done with this thing if you're really looking for an explosive weapon to have. The Synoid Gamma Core. So, this is going in the great category with a caveat. This needs ammo mutation. Needs. Honestly, might suggest ammo mutation and also carrier. If you don't have ammo, this thing uses so much ammo. Like, the nerf, whenever it came to this weapon, which I would, honestly, pre-nerf this, it would be in my top 5, no problem. But, because of its incredibly dire ammo economy, if you're not making sure you have ammo for this thing, it's going to burn all through it. So, while this weapon can do a lot of damage, it is held back by how much ammo generation you need for it. The Talons. Another thrown trigger weapon. MR fodder. The Telos Akbolto. So, unfortunately, at the MR where these sit, they're just not good enough. Unless you really like the Akbolto series, these are just going to end up being MR fodder. Even with their Syndicate proc, they're just not good enough. The Twin Grakatas, on the other hand, fall into the great category, but have similar downsides like the Synoid Gamma Core. Unfortunately, these weapons they have so much DACA, but to support so much DACA, they use a lot of motherfucking ammo. You're like carrier and like primed ammo mutation, like you're gonna need it. That being said, these weapons have the highest burst DPS of any secondary, So take that for what you will. If you can support the ammo economy of these fucking things, you're gonna have some fucking DACA. That's all I'm saying. The Twin Gremlins. So if you happen to get these, like the first run you do on the boss, that it's not likely to use as MR fodder. It's really unlikely that you're gonna get any real use out of these weapons. They're unfortunate MR fodder. I really like how they look though. The Twin Comac. So unfortunately, I love how these things sound, and they've got a really good feel to them, but no stats to back it up. Really unfortunate MR fodder. You get them just so too late for them to be of any use to you. The Twin Roga, very similar to the Twin Comac. They just, having the magazine size of 2 and having to reload as much as you do, even though these weapons have okay damage, you're just not getting that okay damage enough for these weapons to really fall anywhere, and getting these after the War Within, you've already got better secondaries, which makes these MR fodder. The Twin Viper. So, if you wanted to shoot marshmallows really fast, this is probably the best way to do it. The Tysis. So this weapon falls into the good category. Unfortunately, I probably would have in the past put this in the great category. However, there are so many weapons that do status now that have a faster fire rate than this, that this thing's near guaranteed status. Like just putting, like you're gonna get guaranteed status at very low requirements with this thing. If you're looking to put like just shred armor or whatever you got to do, you can do it. Like if you're gonna put corrosive viral on this thing, that's the thing to do, and you can have all armor gone, viral procced enemies if you really want it. But unfortunately, that's really not enough to put it above the good category. A single Vasto. So this thing's alright early on. Willing to put it into the good category, provided you're getting it very early, around the time you would get a Lex. Unfortunately, that's not super likely, but if you happen upon it, it is usable, but for most players, it's going to be MR fodder. The Vasto Prime. So a lot of people would argue that this is kind of an offset to the Lex Prime, but I really can't agree. Having like the magazine size that it does at the 10% less critical chance and status than the Lex Prime, and like it's slash focused, which is good, but it's just really not enough to make it competitive. Let's hope that whenever we get Vasto Prime, those weapons get boosts in other places besides just being able to hold 2, because that weapon's also not really going to be enough. Alright, the Vasto and Marelok. So, for anyone who is disappointed that the Vasto Prime is not that good, and is looking for something very stylish, this is the Vasto and Marelok. It is an incredibly good weapon, only held back by having a 1.5 critical multiplier, or else it would probably overtake the Lex Prime for that number 3 slot, but unfortunately it has the 1.5, which puts it at number 4. This weapon has incredible status, good fire rate, high damage. This is your faster firing, more status focused Lex Prime, essentially. And of course, it's got the Syndicate proc to heal you, so if you're looking for a secondary weapon that can heal you and also do some fucking dirt, this is the way to go. It is incredibly powerful, and being locked at MR6 is nuts. If you get to MR6 and get this, the moment you touch this weapon, like once you get your MR6 hands on this, everything else in my top 5 needs so much work, like to really like achieve its top 5 ranking. Like the Staticore needs like 3+ Forma, the Lex needs like 5, the Lex Prime needs like 6. The Stiletto Prime needs like 3. This weapon on none or 1 Forma is competing with those because of like the incredible status and just the high damage. It's very powerful. And if you do the work even beyond that, it gets even better because you can use a critical build on this. It is totally viable. It's very powerful. It is a very strong weapon, and it's also probably stylistically my favorite weapon in the game in terms of secondaries, so it's got that going for it too. Finally, we have the Viper. Once again, this is a marshmallow gun, unfortunate. And we have the Wraith Twin Vipers. So, these are, I mean, hold on. Oh, 25 fire rate. Okay, no, this and the regular Twin Vipers, you can shoot marshmallows at the same speed, either way. If you wanted to get all of your bullets out of your fucking inventory as fast as you can, these are good ways to do it and get nothing out of it. Like, you can just fire these into an enemy and they'll just do nothing. It's a pretty good way to go if you're looking to tickle enemies to death. You can have a pillow fight with these by just shooting them at each other. I'm sure it'll be great. Yeah, those weapons are abysmal. So yeah, that's everything. Yeah. Man, there are less secondaries than I thought, I guess. Huh. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this. And I'll see you for the primary review when it comes around, which should be soon.